Welcome back to my devlog. Today we'll take a deep dive into one specific aspect of the game. We will look at all the small parts that go into shooting a gun in the game. Most game devs and tutorials stay with trivial code, but most actual games are fairly complex. So instead of looking at a whole but trivial game, we'll look at the full complexity of this part. And at the end, I'll give you 5 tips for vastly improving your code quality. Let's go! The player has a weapon in his inventory, he selects the weapon, selects his target, shoots, target gets some effect. And here are all the pieces that go into it that interact with each other to make that happen. There are 2 panels involved actually. The first is when I select a crew member, the selected crew member panel will activate. And it has this inventory down here. So the inventory container has the large button and 2 small buttons. And when I press on one of them, the UI manager gets informed that that was pressed, and it will set this variable to the selected item in that slot. Then this other panel that is listening will detect the change of the selected item, and it will pop up the other panel after setting this one here, after setting all the name, description and icons. And that's what this looks like in game. When I select this guy, this panel shows up. Now I pick up the gun, and when I select the gun, this panel shows up. So as a quick flowchart, when the player presses the inventory button, the mono behavior that manages the player panel, including the inventory, sets the selected item variable. This is listened to by the panel manager for the item panel. It gets all the information from the scriptable object that stores the item data and writes them into the panel. While that seems overly complex at first, there's a reason for this. By decoupling all the different elements of the game from each other, like these 2 panels for example, all these parts can be written, debugged and so on independently of each other, because they don't need to know anything about what the other thing does or even that it exists. The inventory button does not know or care if there is item information shown on the screen. Let's look at the second part of this interaction, when the player presses an action key to fire the gun. First, the action key is communicated by Rewired, my input manager, link in the description, to an input bridge, which creates an action event as a scriptable object event. Like all my other messaging system, this is an observable variable. A script that handles all grid interactions, like movement and so on, is listening to this event, and when this event is triggered, it will check the grid position on which the mouse cursor was at that moment. So now we know that the player is firing a weapon and at which position in the grid he's firing it. We will now spawn the effect prefab, which adds a game object to the scene with a mono behavior attached, the effect controller. The effect controller initializes the effect, it looks up the item scriptable object, and in the item scriptable object it looks up the impact of that weapon. If it doesn't have an impact yet, at this moment an impact will be assigned. So now the effect prefab knows what effect will actually happen to the target that was hit. Through the grid position, it knows which creature is located at that position, so it can now send a message to the creature controller, which applies that effect to the creature, and this in turn accesses the creature scriptable object, which contains information such as health or what happens to this creature if a specific special effect is applied. Now that we know what's supposed to happen, let's look at the code that makes it happen. So for the first part, important are the Rewired input manager. Rewired comes with its own editor where you can set your keyboard maps and mouse maps. So I've defined the right mouse button as the action key, and here you can see that space is also defined as the action key. So these are the actions, and that's just a button press. And then I have on my input manager over here my input observables bridge script, which does exactly what it says in the name. It takes player actions and forwards them to observable actions so that I can simply subscribe to these, and I have decoupled, rewired from the rest of the game, so the rest of the game doesn't need to know where the input is coming from, how it's handled, on which exact input event type I'm triggering, and so on. All this is here, and this is a very simple script which just on a given action notifies the listeners of the specific observables event. So after I have triggered this event from the input observables, there's another script on my input manager which handles all the grid interaction, and it is listening to the select, action and cancel events. A script that looks like this. Here are the events I'm listening to, and here are the methods I'm calling when these events are triggered. We are interested in the action, so let's go down here. So what I'm doing is I'm getting the mouse position here, which is a function that I use quite a bit throughout this script. It checks the main camera. Screen to world point is how I get from the mouse position the position in Unity coordinates, and then I use the grid world to cell function to convert that to the grid cell that I'm over with my mouse at that moment. So this is triggered in the moment when I press the action button, so it means this is the grid cell that the mouse cursor was over at the moment when I clicked the action button. Right, then I make sure that I do have a crew member selected and I do have an item selected, otherwise other things happen. So if I have an item selected, I'm checking here if I can afford to use it. Do I have enough action points left? If not, I'm setting the selected item to null because anyway I can't use this item, and I'm showing an appropriate message. If I can use the item, I check the distance because it has a range, or maybe has a range. And if the distance is higher than the range, then I show the out of range message and I just return. I don't set the variable to null here because I can still fire the same weapon maybe at a closer target. And if all these checks pass, it means wonderful, I can use this weapon. So I'm using up the action points for my crew member. I'm instantiating the effect that is stored in the selected item variable. There's an effect prefab value on that, and I instantiate at the center of the grid cell that was clicked or that was selected here. And then I get the effect controller. I check if the effect controller exists. If not, I throw an error. At the moment I don't know what else to do there. Probably I should catch it somehow. And then I call the init effect method and I tell it which crew member was shooting, what the mouse position was, the exact mouse position, and what was the grid position that I was using. And then I set the selected item variable value to null. If I want to use the same weapon again, I have to select it again from the inventory. And everything else is handled here in the init effect. So let's look there. I have a prefab here for my ray gun effect. This prefab has a hit effect, which at the moment is just a circle. I will make something more beautiful in the future. And it has the ray of the ray gun, which is a line renderer with just a little bit of color to it. So these are the visuals. And then I have this effect controller, and this effect controller has a reference to the line renderer, and it has a reference to the item. The effect knows which item, so effects and items are closely linked, and if you go to the ray gun, also knows which effect. So these two are linked together. The effect knows the weapon, and the weapon knows the effect. Alright, so this is our effect, and this is our effect controller here. Let's look at that. It gets the crew controller, it gets the target grid position and the target position, and then this is just a very simple method down here which destroys it after a given time so that it doesn't hang around. So after 2 seconds the effect will disappear. And then if a line renderer is set, maybe not all weapons will have this line effect, so some of them may not, because this is the effect controller. It's not a ray gun controller, it's an effect controller. It will be in general for all kinds of weapons. Then, wonderful, I will set the crew transform position and the target position so that the line renderer goes from this point to that point. So that's our shooting line. And then I set the positions. Wonderful. Yes, here's a note. I'm not yet checking for anything in between which could be hit. That's for the future. Wonderful. So now I'm finding, okay, which creature will be hit. I know my target grid position, and I will find at this position the creature controller. If there is a creature controller, it means I've hit a creature. Wonderful. Apply the weapon impact. So I'm getting the impact SO from the item. Get impact from item is the function here on the object manager, which, let's look at the object manager very quickly. Get impact from item. If the item does not yet have an impact set, then we will randomly pick an impact and assign it to this item and then remove it from the list so that each impact only happens once. Basically, in the board game, you have impact tiles that you draw. So once a tile is drawn and assigned to a weapon, it's not available anymore to be assigned to a different weapon. And then we return it. And of course, if there is already an impact assigned, then we simply return this impact. Okay, wonderful. So that's our effect controller. We get the impact. If it's a damage, then we apply the damage. On the creature controller, there's a method that says take damage, which will reduce the health. We reduce the current health by the amount of damage that was caused. If that means our health goes to 0 or less, it means we die. And we return true if we want to check if the shot killed something. If not, if we're not yet dead, then we return false, and die at the moment simply is destroy the game object. Later on there will be some animation played, maybe score increased, stuff like that. We don't have that yet. Okay, so the creature hits. We have the same thing for heal. If the effect is to heal the creature, we will do the opposite. There's a method that says heal. And the same for the various special effects. So if it duplicates and so on, grow, shrink, etc., we just call the respective function on the creature controller, and the creature controller then will do whatever is necessary for the creature to grow, check which are the eggs that we should spawn, or to shrink, or to split. Then we will create multiple instances around and so on. Stun is very easy. We have a function stun. We just set that to true. So all these different effects are applied here, and that's it. Special things worth noting. Item SO is a scriptable object. Usually we want to treat scriptable object as read only. But here we write into the scriptable object. And that's intentional because in this exact case we want that the impact is shared among all items of this kind. So writing it into the scriptable object is exactly what we want. It will affect even items that are spawned later. Take a note, this will change the scriptable object in the editor. In the player, scriptable object changes are not retained between plays. They are not saved anywhere. This is an editor effect. In this case, it doesn't matter, because when we start the game, we set all the effects to null anyway. Finally, I promised you 5 things that will massively improve your code, make it easier to maintain and debug, and help you keep your sanity. Here they are. 1. Decouple your code. Use events, messages, anything to make your different code pieces as independent from each other as possible. In an ideal world, you would be able to switch out each script for another script that does the same thing but works in a completely different way, with different variables, method names and so on, and everything would still work. You can use my observables package or any of the other 20 or so event systems on the asset store. Just don't, let's make that number 2, stop using send message and broadcast message. They are the right tool in a tiny set of special use cases. No, not that one. Almost everything else will be better handled with, well, events of some kind. First, because they call by strings, and that's a surefire way to put a really hard to find bug into your code. And secondly, it's hell to pass multiple or complex parameters, and you'll end up defining data classes just so you can pass them around. Number 3, split up visuals and gameplay logic. I use a child object with all the game logic on the main object and all the visuals on the child object. The main object then communicates any state changes that might affect the visuals to the child object and lets that one worry about how to visualize that, if a sound effect should be played, and so on. 4. Use mixers for sound. Always. If you don't, you're in for a world of hurt further down the line. For example, when players ask for a config option to change the volume, but only for the background music, or only for the voiceovers, or whatever. I usually define 4 mixer channels as soon as I start putting sounds. Music, sound effects, UI sounds, voices. 5. Learn to use annotations to clean up your inspectors and consider using tools like Odin Inspector, link in the description. The most important annotations that I'm using all the time are serialize field, hide an inspector, and require component. If you're not using Odin Inspector, there are a few annotations in the unit core that will help you making your inspector easier to read, such as header attribute, range, text area, and tooltip. Spending just a little time to make your inspector better will save you a lot of time and confusion later on during development when you don't remember the minute details of the script anymore because you're busy working on something else. And that's it for now. In the next devlog I will look at wait, I don't know what yet, because I'm still developing the game. So whatever happens in the time until then, that's what we will look at. See you then, bye bye.